Hey everyone, I hope you're all doing well today. This time we're going to be looking at WWF WrestleMania, the arcade game on the Sega Genesis. This is the second version of WWF WrestleMania, the arcade game that I've played so far, and I think it has a few advantages over the Super Nintendo port. But I also have a lot of the same problems with it as I did with that version. So the game only really has two game modes if you're playing in single player. If you're playing on two player, there's also a head-to-head and a co-op mode. I didn't go into those. Regardless of that, you do have a larger roster than the Super Nintendo game, and I think it looks a little bit better, but I'll talk about that when I get into the graphics. All of the matches are 2 out of 3 falls, which means you need to win twice in order to advance. It's very much like a fighting game, just taking place in a wrestling ring. It makes a lot of sense when you find out, oh yeah, Midway did this, so it is kind of like Mortal Kombat. With the first mode, the Intercontinental Championship, you have 4 matches where you're only facing one opponent at a time. That works out a whole hell of a lot better because it's pretty easy to just beat down your opponent, get the pinfall, and move on. After that 4th match, though, then you take on 2 opponents at once, and then for the last match for the title, you take on 3 at once. It feels really cheap, but you can get your opponent to actually hit each other. So they will occasionally start to fight, but it won't really last for very long. They'll just do a move, accidentally hit one of their teammates. It helps you out a little bit, but it doesn't help you out enough. With the WWF Championship mode, you start off right away by facing 2 opponents at the same time. It's really a pain in the ass to get through this mode. I'm assuming you just get to 3 opponents at once much faster, and I didn't make it that far because, yeah, the game is really cheap, and it is it's not impossible, but it's really annoying to go through it. I think I mentioned earlier there are 8 characters you can choose from, so you have Doink, Razor Ramon, The Undertaker, Yokozuna, Bam Bam Bigelow, Shawn Michaels, Bret Hart, and Lex Luger. It's fine. It's an okay roster. It is better than the Super Nintendo one, but just because there are 2 more characters. WWF WrestleMania, the arcade game, is one of the best looking games on the Sega Genesis. It's definitely the best looking of the wrestling games, which there aren't that many. I think Saturday Night Slam Masters is a little bit better, but we're just kind of splitting hairs at this point. It does look much better than the Super Nintendo version of WrestleMania, the arcade game, so there is that. It's very close, though. The digitized sprites look really good, the crowd looks fantastic, the animation for the moves is really great. The developers did a much better job on this port of the game when I compared it to something like the first Mortal Kombat. This one did a lot better when they were porting it over, or at least it looks much better when they were porting it over. There aren't those weird red pixels, and everything pretty much lines up the way it's supposed to. There are some strange things, though. Your character will occasionally, snap into position when you're trying to hit your opponent. If you're on, a slightly lower level or something like that, it'll just sort of snap you up a little bit to where you're supposed to be, whether you are hitting them or getting hit. It doesn't really impact the gameplay all that much, but it is kind of interesting to see something like this happen, just because you wouldn't really expect it all that much. Overall, it's a fantastic looking game. I really love the art style in this one. I think it's very cartoonish and over the top, and in many ways, this style really reflects what WWE represented at the time, or what WWF represented at the time. I think this is the better version of the game when I compare it to the Super Nintendo version. It just feels a lot easier than that one. Not that the other game was particularly hard, but both of them just sort of feel a little bit different, where this one, you can kind of get away with doing some things that with the Super Nintendo game, it felt too cheap to really let you do. Don't get me wrong, this game is very cheap, but it doesn't feel as cheap as the Super Nintendo game is, where you just kind of lose and you're not really sure why. Both games play the exact same way, but this one, for some odd reason, it was just a little bit easier. I was actually able to win the Intercontinental Championship in this game, whereas in the Super Nintendo one, it felt like I just never had a chance. This also has a better roster. It's still not a great roster, but just having those extra 2 characters makes a big difference, so that you don't see as many repeat characters like you do here with, having 2 Undertakers on the screen. There's less of a chance of that than there is with the Super Nintendo game, where you only have 6 people. And yeah, I think it looks a little bit better than the Super Nintendo one. It's not too different, but it feels a little bit crisper, like you have more detail in the Sega Genesis, which sounds weird to say because you're talking about a system that just wasn't as powerful as the Super Nintendo. It just feels a little odd to say that there was more stuff in this game than there was in the Super Nintendo version, because you would think it would either be the other way around or they would be the exact same. But it's a little bit like Midway and Acclaim thought this version or the Sega Genesis deserved a better version, or something like that. I'm not really sure exactly what happened, and I couldn't really find out when I went looking. However, just like the Super Nintendo version, I wish this was a better game. It has many things going for it, but just a lack of game modes really sucks. If you were playing this by yourself, you only have those 2 really gauntlet matches to go through, and then that's kind of it. Like, this style worked really well in the arcades with, fighting games and that sort of thing, where they were just trying to get your quarters. But when it comes to the home console, you kind of expect a little bit more than that. It is basically a fighting game that's using WWF wrestlers, and it has wrestling moves in it instead of the martial arts moves, and there are no finishers in this, at least that I could tell, or at least some that would resemble Mortal Kombat, which is kind of understandable. The game is still over the top and very cartoonish, which is really fun to play, but there's just not a whole lot there. It's a good arcade game, but kind of an average console game. It has excellent graphics. The gameplay it's okay. It's not really anything great, just because of a lack of game modes. It's still fun to try out every once in a while, though. Anyway, that's going to wrap things up. Let me know what you think in the comments section below, and I will talk to you all later. Bye.